They thought her accent meant ignorance. That was their first mistake. Courtroom full of suits snickered under their breath when Julianne Peterson stood to speak, but not because of what she said. Let us know in the comments section below. What do you think happens when those same voices find themselves answering to the one they used to mock? Julianne wasn't supposed to be standing in front of them. Not here. Not today. Not in this courtroom. Not in this case. Not in this firm's perfectly pressed world of tailored arrogance and practiced smirks. Yet, there she was, back straight, chin up, suit tailored sharp across her shoulders. The kind of woman who no longer asked for a seat at the table. She brought the damn table. She knew every corner of the courtroom. The scuffed baseboards behind the plaintiff's bench, the way the mic on the far left always cracked with static, and most of all, the faces that didn't age as much as they calcified. The same old boys' club was here, and just like before, they whispered behind their clipboards. Same dismissive glances, same wrinkled noses when she opened her mouth. The only thing that had changed was her. The first time Julianne Peterson stood in this very courtroom, she was 28 and fresh out of Howard Law. The room swallowed her. Her hands shook when she set her files down. The nameplate they gave her was misspelled. Juliana instead of Julianne. "We'll fix it," they said. They never did. That was 7 years ago. Back then, she was a public defender with a case file bigger than her paycheck. Now she stood before them on a case that had gripped half the city and threatened to crush the other half. She wasn't fresh. She was fire. But it wasn't the case that rattled her nerves this time. It was the man across the aisle. Jason Crumbing. Rowley and Hess was embossed in gold across every document on their table. Same law firm that once mocked her accent when she dared cross-examine a white defendant they were defending. She remembered it. How Mason leaned over to his associate and whispered, "Does she always sound like she's from a cartoon?" The courtroom had chuckled. The judge didn't say a word. Julianne never forgot. She didn't cry that day, not where they could see. But back at her office, door locked, lights out, she replayed their laughter like a looping track. She knew she couldn't fix their prejudice, but she could make sure they never laughed at her again. Julianne took a breath. "Your Honor," she said, voice calm, warm, firm, the kind of voice that came from someone who had learned how to bleed with dignity. "I'd like to request a brief recess to confer with my client." The judge, different from last time, thankfully, nodded without question. Respect sounded different now. It had weight when it came from her. She walked out into the hallway where Trina was waiting. Trina Lopez, her best friend and the only other person who knew what Julianne had sacrificed to be standing there in those heels in that moment. "You good?" Trina asked, sipping on lukewarm coffee, already knowing the answer. Julianne nodded. "He didn't recognize me." Yet, they exchanged a look. Then Julianne turned back toward the courtroom door. She didn't need long. Just enough time to remind herself she didn't come back to prove anything. She came to win. Back inside, Mason was smirking. Of course he was. He leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, one hand resting dramatically across the table like he was starring in his own corporate drama. His associate, Rachel, young, white, just like Julianne had been, leaned over and whispered something that made him grin wider. "Miss Peterson," Mason said when she passed by, "still practicing down south?" Julianne turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his eyes. "No, Mr. Crowley," she said, with the quiet thunder of someone who had waited years for this exact moment. "I teach down south, but every now and then I take a break to remind people like you that a drawl doesn't mean dumb." She kept walking before he could respond. In her seat, Julianne opened her folder and skimmed through her notes, not because she needed to, but because she needed to look calm, controlled, strategic. Her client, a woman named Cassandra Ray, sat beside her with eyes wide and full of that same fear. Julianne once knew too well. She gently placed a hand over Cassandra's. "We got this," she whispered. Because they did. She knew Mason's tactics, the way he'd charm the jury, toss little phrases like emotional overreaction or confused memory to undermine a victim's credibility. But this time, Julianne had evidence. This time, she had a timeline he couldn't wiggle out of, and this time, she had herself. They recessed for lunch shortly after. Julianne stepped into the break room on the third floor and was about to heat up her sad little Tupperware meal when she heard it again. From the corner of the room, two young attorneys, likely interns, were chuckling. She didn't even have to guess. "She talks like a podcast from Mississippi," one whispered. Julianne didn't move. She just opened the microwave, slid her food in, and waited. They turned when they heard the beep. "Oh," one said. "Sorry, we didn't realize." Julianne didn't make them sweat. She just smiled, the kind of smile that left scars. "Don't worry," she said. "You'll learn better." And with that, she walked back out, her head high, her footsteps soft but final. Outside, the sky had shifted. A soft haze sat low over the courthouse, but Julianne didn't care. She had a closing argument to prepare. And justice? Justice was getting louder. He said it loud enough for her to hear. That was the part that stuck with Julianne. Not the mockery itself, but the confidence, the casualness of it, the way Mason Crowley laughed like he was commenting on the weather. It happened during her first real case. She wasn't lead counsel, just assisting. But the stakes were high. A wrongful arrest. Her client, Jamal Booker, had been accused of breaking into a hardware store. The only evidence was that he was standing outside it, midday, waiting for a ride share. Julianne had found the security footage herself. You could clearly see Jamal standing still, arms crossed, checking his phone. The break-in didn't happen until hours later, but Mason, slick as always, argued intent, presence, and every other vague term he could twist. Julianne had requested to question the responding officer, her first time addressing the court directly. Her voice had trembled, sure, her accent had slipped through, but her points were sharp. The footage, the timeline, the total absence of stolen goods, none of it made sense. She remembered the moment it hit. Mason leaned in toward his second chair. Some guy named Clay, equally smug, and said with a theatrical whisper, "She sounds like the lawyer version of Green Acres." They laughed. So did the bailiff. Even the judge smirked. Julianne had frozen, just for a second, then continued her cross as if nothing had happened. But that night, in her car, she had screamed until her throat ached. She stayed at Trina's apartment for 3 days. Trina threatened to report the judge, the firm, the whole courtroom, but Julianne had shaken her head. "Let it go," she said. "I'll show them later, when it matters." And now she was here, and it mattered. Back in the present, Cassandra sat beside her, thumbing the edge of a tissue. She'd been accused of embezzling $400,000, 0 cents from Holloway Enterprises, a tech firm that Julianne knew had ties to Crowley and Hess. The case stank from every angle. Cassandra had no prior infractions, no sudden wealth, and no access to 2 of the 3 flagged accounts. But she did have one thing. She'd reported her manager, Derek Holloway, for inappropriate conduct 6 months earlier. And now here they were. Crowley was representing Holloway's firm, the same firm investigating Cassandra, and, not so coincidentally, not investigating Derek at all. Julianne knew the pattern. Silence women, protect men, smear reputations. But this time they picked the wrong woman to try and silence. Trina entered the courtroom just as the afternoon session began, sliding into the back row with a fresh cup of coffee for Julianne, and a grin like she knew something good was coming. "Ready?" Julianne asked Cassandra under her breath. Cassandra nodded, though her hands trembled. Across the room, Mason adjusted his tie, his smirk so wide it was practically a dare. Who have issues. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, walking toward the center with the quiet confidence of someone who had been on both ends of courtroom cruelty. What do you think guilt looks like? She paused. Is it a number on a spreadsheet? A name on a bank record? A woman who filed a complaint and suddenly 6 months later is the only one under scrutiny? Mason's brow furrowed, just slightly. This isn't about money, Julianne said. It's about power, and who gets to use it. Objections followed. Sustained. Overruled. The usual chaos. But Julianne had done what she came to do. Plant the seed. During cross, she took apart the internal investigator from Holloway Enterprises like she was peeling an orange. So, just to confirm, she said sweetly, you started your audit after Cassandra filed the complaint against her manager? Yes, he said, swallowing, but it was unrelated. Unrelated. Interesting. Because your firm didn't look into any other employees, just her. Well, her login was used to transfer funds she had no access to. Isn't it true those credentials were shared across the team? He fumbled. I mean, they weren't supposed to be, were they? Yes. Julianne stepped back. No further questions. Even Mason shifted in his seat. The judge called for a break. Outside the courtroom, Julianne sat on the marble bench in the hallway, watching Cassandra sip water like she hadn't tasted it in days. You believe me, right? Cassandra asked suddenly, her voice low, urgent. Julianne turned toward her. Believing you isn't the issue, she said. Proving them wrong is. The door creaked. Mason stepped out. Alone. He approached slowly. You've come a long way from the girl who cried in the parking lot, he said. Julianne didn't flinch. You remember that? Of course I do. I remember everything. Well, she said, rising, so do I. They locked eyes. You'll lose, Mason said. Eventually. Doesn't matter how good you are. Firms like mine, we write the rules. Julianne didn't blink. Then I'll rewrite them. She walked back into the courtroom before he could speak again. Trina watched her from the back, arms crossed. She mouthed one word. Queen. Julianne smirked. The court reconvened. Julianne flipped open her binder and looked to the jury. All eyes were on her, and she knew. Without a doubt, this time they were listening. She leaned into the mic. Let's talk about what it really means, she said. To be silenced. And the courtroom went quiet. But not for long. The elevator doors closed behind her with a soft whump, but Julianne barely noticed. Her hands were still warm from the lectern, her fingertips still twitching from the rhythm of her voice as it echoed across the courtroom. She'd always been told to slow down her words, to clip her vowels, to erase the part of her that Alabama had raised. But today, she let every syllable drawl out like a whip crack. She made them feel every word. Cassandra had smiled for the first time when the jury leaned forward during Julianne's closing remark. It wasn't a big smile, just a twitch at the corners of her mouth, but it was the smile of a woman who had been gaslit by her employer, shamed by the press, and silenced by her own legal team. Until now. Julianne stepped out into the courthouse plaza and squinted against the brightness. A photographer across the street was already snapping shots. She didn't pose. She didn't slow down. She walked. Beside her, Trina caught up with quick strides. You hit them hard, Trina said, falling into pace with her. Like HBO drama hard. Julianne smirked, eyes still ahead. That's what they get for casting me as the extra. They walked until they reached the shade of a row of elms. Trina passed her a granola bar from her bag and nudged her shoulder. "Mason's pissed," she said. "His whole face went red when you said, 'The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, it's evidence of cover-up.'" "I borrowed that from one of his old interviews," Julianne said, unwrapping the bar slowly. Trina blinked. "Yeah." Julianne took a bite, chewing slowly, watching a man in a charcoal suit across the courtyard shift nervously as he recognized her. It's a full-circle kind of day. Back upstairs, Mason wasn't sitting still. His voice echoed off the oak walls of the private conference room. "She's playing the jury like a fiddle," he snapped, slamming a file onto the table. "And you," he pointed at Rachel, his associate, "you gave her the opening with that line about Cassandra being overly emotional. What the hell were you thinking?" Rachel crossed her arms, but didn't speak. She wasn't going to defend herself, not after what she'd seen that morning. Julianne hadn't just defended her client. She had dismantled the entire illusion that this courtroom was neutral. And Rachel, young and just 2 years out of law school, had seen something shift in her. "She's better than you think," Rachel finally said. Mason looked up. "Excuse me?" "Is better. And you knew it the moment she walked in." He didn't respond, just stared at the window. Because it was true. Julianne hadn't returned with vengeance. She returned with strategy. She didn't just bring evidence. She brought mirrors, made the jury see themselves in Cassandra, made them remember how easily they too had been passed over, second-guessed, misjudged. Back in her office, Julianne sat at her desk, kicking off her heels. The sun streamed through the blinds, stripes of gold across her framed degrees, her photos, her old notes from that first year of law. There was one she never removed. A sticky note. It read, "Speak slower, smile more, lose the accent." She left it there, to remind herself what they wanted her to become. And every day she didn't fold, she felt it burn a little more. Her phone buzzed. "Unknown number," she answered. "Miss Peterson?" The voice on the other end was low, gravelly, uncertain. "This is she." "Very much, Everett. This is Judge Mo." Julianne blinked. "Hello, Your Honor. You handled yourself well today." The people said, "Well, what can we do for exercise?" They tell me, "Oh, I want to go get surgery." I'm like, "Well, okay, fresh stride."
Mm-hmm.
I put the person in a circuit, and they tell me what to do.
Mm-hmm.
There was a pause. "You were in my courtroom once, years ago." "I remember." "You argued the Henderson case." "Yes." Another pause, longer this time, like something was being unsaid. "Better." The judge began, then stopped. "You've come a long way." Julianne waited. "And it's good to see you, still standing." The call ended. No goodbye. Julianne leaned back in her chair, eyes to the ceiling. That wasn't an apology, but it was something. The next morning came fast. Final arguments. Julianne arrived early, standing outside the courtroom before the bailiff even unlocked the doors. Trina joined her 10 minutes later, carrying coffee and a folder under her arm. "Got something for you," she said. Julianne raised a brow. Witness list from a former accountant at Holloway Enterprises. Whistleblower. Julianne took the folder, flipping it open. Her lips parted slightly. This changes everything." Thought it might. The courtroom filled quickly. Spectators lined the benches, law students, reporters, former clients, and in the far back row, quietly, was Judge Miles. Julianne didn't react, just took her seat. Mason tried to catch her eye across the aisle. She didn't look up. When it was her turn, she stood again. She adjusted the mic and took a moment to scan the jury's faces. "I want to talk about silence," she said. A hush fell. Not a breath stirred. There are two kinds of silence, the kind that protects and the kind that punishes. She walked slowly, her heels clicking like punctuation. For 6 months, my client was told to stay quiet. She was told the issue would be handled. She was told not to rock the boat. And then, she was told she was the problem. She stopped in front of the jury box. But the numbers don't lie. The timelines don't shift. And now, you've heard from someone inside the company who saw everything and chose, finally, to speak. She let that settle. Let them sit with it. Then, softly, "Don't let silence win again." She returned to her seat. Cassandra stared ahead, not blinking. Trina, in the gallery, wiped a tear. And Mason shifted in his chair like the floor was suddenly too hot beneath him. Because it was. And Julianne? Julianne didn't smile. Not yet. When the verdict came in, the room didn't breathe. 12 faces, quiet as stone, stared forward as the foreperson rose. Cassandra gripped Julianne's wrist beneath the table, her knuckles white. The judge, this one at least, a fair one, asked for the decision to be read aloud. Julianne sat tall, hands folded, her face unreadable. On the charge of embezzlement, the foreperson said, "We find the defendant, Cassandra Ray, not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, a few cheers, a stifled sob from Cassandra's mother in the second row. The judge banged the gavel twice, calling for order. But the moment had already spilled over the brim. Cassandra covered her mouth, her eyes brimming. Julianne leaned close, not smiling yet. "We're not dumb." Mason stood frozen, his jaw locked. He didn't move, didn't flinch. The victory wasn't just the verdict, it was the silence that came after. The kind that said, "You lost, and you know it." The judge thanked the jury, dismissed them, and court adjourned. But Julianne didn't rise right away. She let the others leave, the spectators, the gallery, even Mason, who brushed past her without a word. Only when it was nearly empty did she finally stand. Cassandra hugged her tight. "How did you do it?" she whispered. Julianne's voice was calm, even. "I didn't do it alone." In the hallway, cameras flashed, reporters swarmed. Julianne shielded Cassandra with her arm and made her way through the crowd with slow, steady steps. "What's next for Miss Ray?" someone shouted. Julianne didn't stop. Healing. She escorted Cassandra to a waiting car and closed the door gently behind her. Then she turned to face the microphones. "Any comment on Mason Crowley's cross-examination tactics?" one reporter asked. Julianne's smile was small. "Let the record speak." A week passed. The footage of the trial, especially Julianne's final argument, circulated online like wildfire. Law blogs called it a masterclass in composure and command. Civil rights organizations reached out. Students from law schools across the country messaged her inbox, thanking her for showing them what advocacy could really look like. And then came the call. From the city courthouse, not for a case, for an appointment. Trina met her on the courthouse steps that morning, holding a small navy box with a gold trim. "Thought you might need this," she said. Julianne opened it. Inside, a white lace jabot. Simple, elegant, traditional. She laughed, soft and surprised. "I thought you hated the lace." Trina grinned. "I do. But you don't. And it's time they see it." Inside the building, every step echoed. The halls she used to walk with self-doubt now felt like corridors she owned. She stopped just outside Chamber Room B. A clerk stood waiting. "Judge Peterson?" the woman asked, unsure. Julianne nodded. "That's me." The door opened. Inside sat a panel of senior judges and administrators, old names who had served too long, and some fresh ones who looked to her now like students eager to learn. They offered the robe in silence, and she accepted it. The black fabric slid over her arms like armor, heavy but familiar, made for her but never offered. until she took it for herself. She turned to the mirror in the side room and adjusted the collar. The jabot sat neatly beneath her chin. Trina peeked in, her voice soft. "I'd say you look like a judge, but honestly, you just look like you." Julianne laughed. 2 months later, they gave her her first high-profile case. It wasn't until she sat behind the bench that she saw it. The name on the docket, Crowley and Hess LLP v. Marino Technologies. Plaintiff's counsel, Mason Crawley. Julianne adjusted her glasses. She looked out at the courtroom, at the bench where she used to plead her case, at the man who once ridiculed her for daring to stand. Mason walked in. His usual confidence flickered when he saw her. For the briefest moment, his step slowed. She said nothing. He set his case files down with robotic precision, eyes never fully meeting hers. The bailiff announced the case. Julianne cleared her throat, gaze steady. "Court is now in the session. Please be seated." It was the sound of arrival. Not just for her. For every voice that had ever been mocked. For every woman told to speak softer, stand smaller, smile more. For every little girl with a southern accent practicing big speeches in her bedroom mirror. Julianne read through the case notes as the room settled. She looked up one final time and met Mason's eyes. He flinched first. She didn't smile. She just began. Hours later, she exited through the side door, robes trailing behind her. A little girl with beaded braids was waiting with her mother near the sidewalk. The girl held a spiral notebook, clutched to her chest like it was sacred. "Are you really a judge?" the girl asked, eyes wide. Julianne crouched to her level. "I am. Even though you talk like my grandma." Julianne laughed then, big, free, unbothered. "Especially because I talk like your grandma." The girl beamed. Julianne signed her notebook, stood and looked out at the city pulsing around her.
It isn't just accepted now.
She was expected. She was the standard. Justice hadn't just been served, and had been rewritten in her voice. And this time, nobody dared laugh.